special report is part of CBS News' continuing coverage of China in crisis. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
It is mid-morning in China. The Communist Party apparatus and the government continue clamping down behind military units and secret police loyal to them. Official Chinese government television and other propaganda are working hard to create an impression, at least create an impression, that the chaos is subsiding, that the threat of civil war is fading, and that Chinese life is returning to normal under the hardline communist leadership. There can be little doubt now that the old-line communists are back on top, at least for the moment. The only troops in the streets were making it a point today not to appear hostile, apparently content to be just seen. The soldiers so despised for executing the massacre in Tiananmen Square over the weekend and praised today by the premier have been pulled out. Their replacements in the square and elsewhere in Beijing are troops who've been told to smile and make friends. Also in the streets, people who know only too well what transpired at Tiananmen Square were trickling back to work, doing what the government had told them to do, that is to pretend that normality had returned to their lives and that not much had happened. Traffic was being directed now by police, not the military, as was the case for a long while. Another sign the government made a point of saying that civil order is indeed being restored. And again, there was food for the buying. Fresh vegetables were available for the first time since last week. Some of the prices were higher than before. China's apparently victorious hardliners, at least for now, are using government television to twist the bloody events of this past week to their advantage, as we hear now live from China and Bob Simon. Bob?
Dan, one of the first clues as to who's won a war is who's wearing the smiles and who's got the brooms. When the inveterate hardline Prime Minister Li Peng made his smiling and triumphant appearance in the Great Hall of the People and on Chinese television last night, it signaled curtains for the democratic movement. This was just so clearly the man who had prevailed. The soldiers are sweeping up now. They've won the battle. Now they're cleaning the battleground, restoring and redefining normalcy, rounding up many from the ranks of their enemies, students and workers. The government has been using Chinese television to broadcast its utterly fictitious account of what happened last weekend. A gang of ruffians, the version goes, whipped up by the United States and by Hong Kong, attacking a restrained and gentle army. The strategy seems to be to invent the past and dominate the future, control the truth, control the country. Many people seem to be buying this official version, even in Beijing, not because they believe it to be true necessarily, but because they know the government is controlled and therefore they'd better listen. There are no visible signs of intramural fighting within the army. If civil war ever was a prospect, it seems to have vanished, or at least receded to the vanishing point. There were reports on the radio here just a short while ago of turmoil in Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province. The radio spoke of the destruction of cars and damage to government buildings. But here in Beijing, Dan, the truth, as best as we can read it, seems to be that the war is over and the people have lost. Dan?
And as best you can read it, Bob Simon, recognizing how difficult it is to make out exactly what's going on, does that finish the pro-democracy, pro-freedom, pro-reform movement for the foreseeable future?
I think it does for the foreseeable future, Dan. We can now see that the smiling face of Chinese communism was a smile written on a stone. When push came to shove, this was a regime willing to shoot its children to survive. But if it's dead in the short term, I think we can at least remember this week that while in 1981 martial law was imposed and imposed thoroughly in Poland, this week the Poles went to the polls.
Bob Simon, live in Beijing. If things were relatively quiet today on the streets of Beijing, and that's the way it looked, it was not the case in some of the hotels and at the airport. Foreigners who sought refuge in hotels struggled to cope with the emergency. Many were U.S. diplomatic dependents and non-essential government personnel. The U.S. State Department ordered them out after Chinese troops fired on 2 diplomatic compounds. At the Beijing airport, more congestion and confusion. It was a repeat of the scene the day before. Hundreds of foreigners waited for flights to take them away from what the U.S. State Department officially called a dangerous situation. U.S. Ambassador James Lilly, he's our new ambassador there, boarded the first chartered flight for Americans to wish them well. Reacting to some criticism about alleged inaction, Lilly said the embassy had taken, in these his words, an awful lot of moves to improve our security, and the biggest one was putting these people on the plane, unquote, the U.S. ambassador. Joining us now are 2 Americans who were on the first U.S. chartered planes to leave Beijing. In San Francisco is Joanne Grady, wife of the U.S. Vice Consul at the Beijing Embassy. And in Tokyo, Evan Gottesman. Gottesman was teaching English at a Beijing medical school. He was in Tiananmen Square as late as 1 hour before the massacre. Mr. Gottesman, do you think the U.S. Embassy moved quickly enough to get Americans out and moved as well as they could to do that?
I think that the bottom line is that those of us who needed to get out or wanted to get out did get out. And there were moments of ineptness, and when I called the embassy and asked if someone could pick me up, they told me I lived too close to the center of the city and they could not pick me up. But the bottom line is that I am out of China, and everybody, I think, who wanted to be out of China is out of China, and the charter flight last night was almost empty.
Mrs. Grady, apparently you were in a meeting when the decision was made to evacuate American dependents. Tell us about that.
Well, the ambassador called all the American embassy personnel together on Wednesday morning to discuss voluntary evacuation. And as the meeting started, unfortunately, we heard gunshots all around the embassy. There were like machine guns. They didn't come into the embassy compound, but they were very close. And it was quite obvious that we really needed to get out of there. So it quickly changed to mandatory that all dependents leave within a few hours.
Mr. Gottesman, well, what about casualties? The government has put the official death toll now at 300 and says most of those were soldiers of the Chinese army. Does that match what you witnessed?
Not at all. I mean, when I am a teacher at a medical college, and so many of my students are doctors. And many of them were in Tiananmen Square, and I saw them just hours after the soldiers came in, and they described just horrendous scenes of carnage. And the worst thing about it for them was that as doctors, they were ordered to leave the square, and in fact, their ambulance was shot at, and the soldiers blew out a few windows of the ambulance, and then were not allowed to come back into the square. And I think nothing is worse for a doctor than to know that there are wounded people, losing blood from gunshot wounds and with crushed limbs from tanks, who cannot be saved by the hundreds of doctors on hand willing to save them.
Ms. Grady, what was the weekend like living there in the embassy compound?
Well, the most difficult thing was finding out what was going on. As you know, the news is completely blacked out there, and the Chinese news doesn't really report what's going on. It tells you that everything's calm. Every moment, things were changing. Much of the weekend, I was on the phone trying to find Americans in China or answer phone calls from Americans in China and urge them to get out of China because we felt that the situation was deteriorating relatively quickly. Then the issue was how to get them out of there, and we had to, as you know, take vans out to the universities and get all the students off the campuses. It got increasingly bad as we approached departure because the compound where many of our embassy personnel were living was shot out right a few hours before we all left. So everyone left in a great state of panic, really.
We have only a few seconds left. Mr. Gottesman, based on your experience, what do you think is the most important thing for Americans to know about what is happening in China?
Well, my own interpretation is that even if they round up all the students, the Chinese government still has millions of people who know what happened, and I actually believe that the moment they think it's safe to gather, to chant, to demonstrate in some way, that they will. There's a huge current of rage in Beijing right now.
Thank you both very much, and welcome home.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll be talking to our CBS News consultant, China scholar, expert, novelist Betty Bao Lord about the future of the pro-reform, pro-democracy movement. So stay here with us.